Glad to have you join us. Moody's Investors Service, a leading provider of credit ratings research and risk, changed its outlook for Nigeria's banking system to negative from stable. CBN lifts temporary suspension on checks clearing in Nigeria. Most Asian shares record gains while U.S. stock futures fall today. Well, on the show today, we're looking at the implications of low oil prices on Nigerian banks, particularly with regards to the upstream sector. A lot of borrowings from the banking sector. Let's see how this will play out in talking about the stability of Nigerian banks. Welcome to the show. Moody's Investors Service, a leading provider of credit ratings research and risk analysis, has changed its outlook for Nigeria's banking system to negative from stable. The change reflects the firm's view that banks will face weakening loans quality and foreign currency liquidity challenges as depressed oil prices and coronavirus pandemic weighs on Nigeria's economy. These new difficulties add to existing headwinds from weak economic growth and rising regulatory costs. Nigeria's largest banks will continue to benefit from a high probability of government support. Relationship Manager Investment Banking at FSDH Merchant Bank Limited, Ayodeji Akinwumi, said the current challenges are real, that banks need to develop structures to harness the opportunities in the crisis. Banks' exposure to oil and gas industry substantial at around 27% of total loans at the end of 2019, making the system susceptible to the oil price slump. The managing director of the International Monetary Fund, Christina Georgieva, has said she expects the fund to have granted Nigeria with considerable emergency financing by the end of this month, an indication that IMF would likely offer Africa's biggest economy's request for a $3.4 billion dollar credit. The board of the IMF is expected on Tuesday to consider the loan request aimed at combating the impact of COVID-19 pandemic in the country. Upon approval, the fund will rank among the biggest allocations by the multilateral lender to an African country since the outbreak of the coronavirus. The IMF said around 102 nations have requested aid and support as a result of the pandemic. According to IMF, Africa requires funds around $114 billion to tackle COVID-19 decisively. In furtherance of its efforts in the development of a safe and efficient payment system in the country, the central bank, in collaboration with relevant stakeholders, have reviewed the need for check clearing to accommodate users of checks as one of the payment instruments in the country, despite lockdown of some states and the FCT. In view of this development, the bank hereby lifts temporary suspension of check clearings in the country. Check instruments will be allowed to pass through the clearing system with effect from today, April 28, 2020. That's from the Central Bank of Nigeria. Credit to the economy rose by 850 billion naira in February, with lending to government accounting for 84%, valued at 720 billion naira. This was the highlight of the Depository Corporation survey for February released by the Central Bank of Nigeria. According to the survey, net domestic credit rose by 2.37% to 36.6 trillion naira in February from 35.81 trillion naira in January. Credit to the private sector, however, rose marginally by 0.48% to 26.7 trillion naira in February from 26.57 trillion naira in January. The impact of the crash in prices of crude oil across the globe as a result of the coronavirus pandemic holds devastating consequences for major sectors of the economy, such as manufacturing. The Nigerian banking industry is no exception. So far, the central bank has had to reduce interest rates, amongst other interventions. With a full month of lockdown and not functioning at full scale, the coronavirus dwindling oil prices have had quite a bite on the margins of banks.
It's a major source of inflow for Nigeria as it represents over 90% of the country's foreign exchange earnings and also comprises over 60% of government revenue. Although the oil sector makes about 9% contribution to the GDP, it is an important facilitator of economic activities and a leading indicator for the non-oil sector. In Nigeria, the oil sector is a major source of liquidity So a sharp decrease in oil revenue automatically leads to a negative growth in GDP. The coronavirus pandemic has also led to major lockdowns and restrictions around the world as governments continue to look for measures to contain the virus. The banking industry in Nigeria is not immune to the negative impact of low crude oil prices and the coronavirus pandemic. The crude oil price slump and the global disruptions as a result of the coronavirus pandemic is negatively affecting the credit profile of Nigerian banks. According to Fitch Ratings report, the asset quality deterioration, which is linked to high exposures to the oil and gas sector, is one of the biggest threats to ratings, and the operating environment risks inevitably increases in Nigeria when oil prices fall. Fitch Ratings downgraded 3 Nigerian banks' long-term issuer default ratings to B from B positive and placed all 10 Nigerian banks' viability ratings and IDRs on rating watch negative. Loans and advances in the oil and gas sector constitute about 30% of the total risk assets in the industry. That's according to third quarter reports from last year. A look at trends in 2008 to 2009 as well as 2015 and 2016 when the country was faced with similar circumstances of low oil prices showed an increase in non-performing loans. This reflects the expectation that banks will be under more pressure due to the weaker operating environment in the coming months. Experts continue to highlight that a decline in oil revenue might just lead to a further currency devaluation and thereby increasing the risk of a recession. Operating environment risks are compounded by economic and financial market disruptions, despite the countermeasures to manage the pandemic, putting pressure on all borrowers. Another devastating impact of the low oil prices is how it affects the repayment of credit facilities granted to players in the oil and gas sector. The asset quality of Nigerian banks are likely to continue to deteriorate significantly depending on the duration and severity of the oil price shock and the coronavirus turmoil. This also extends to other sectoral players, especially SMEs in the non-oil sector. In a bid to cushion the negative impact of the low oil prices amid the coronavirus pandemic, the Central Bank of Nigeria continues to announce new measures and tactics to steer the nation's economy away from a possible recession.
I have the senior economist from Lagos Business School, Dr. Bongo Adi. He joins me via Skype from Lagos, Ireland. I also have the Chief Executive Officer, Frontier African Reports, Boason Mafaye. He also joins me via Skype. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me at this time.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Thank you.
All right, let me start with Dr. Adi. Doctor, tell us the linkage between the current COVID-19 pandemic and the turmoil within the global oil market and how it affects indigenous oil producers and their inability to meet loan repayment obligations to banks.
Okay, so, well, it doesn't need much stress. We've all seen what is happening to the global supply chain network. So the most grievous impact of COVID-19 has been on the disruption of the supply chain. So when we talk about the supply chain and logistics, we're just talking about all those the major demand for oil, which is our major export. So with the lockdowns we've seen in all over the world. So what it means is that there is, increase in low demand for the product, which is the crude oil that we sell. So as we saw last week, what happened to the crude oil price in the futures market, where it actually went sub-zero. So that will tell you the prospects of the oil price in the current period. So we've seen our budget benchmark also being, brought downwards, because of the challenges with the oil price downfall. So it's a huge one for us in terms of the risk. So that has collapsed, as it were, all the plannings that we've had. So all the plans seem to be on the revision track right now. So taking that hit, of course, the firms operating in the oil and gas industry, because they are on the front line of the exposure to the impact of COVID-19. So the linkage here is the supply chain disruption, which has reduced drastically the demand for oil all over the world, because factories are closed, manufacturing, have all but, packed up, as the global economy. Nobody's thinking about the economy that much. So what everybody's thinking about is how to protect lives of
Indeed.
people, essentially. So oil is taking, the hit directly, and that has affected our oil companies. And then when we, put into the picture that these companies have become heavily exposed to the banks, because the bulk of the loans given out by Nigerian banks being in the direction of the indigenous oil companies. So that actually makes the situation a lot messier.
Indeed. Let me ask Boason this now, someone who thoroughly understands financial industry and, of course, the oil and gas industry. What do you say now are the immediate quick fix solutions the FG through the central bank can immediately implement? This looks very scary if we are to look at the figures. I was reading through about 3.4 trillion naira already been exposed by the banks.
Too sure if you have any quick fix solutions to look here. I think what we'll need to do is to find a way to find what you call immediate solutions, then we'll move to midterm, then we'll go to long term. How do we move from point A to point B to point C is what will have to be cleverly figured out between the central banks, the indigenous oil companies, and the government at the other. And these are the three parties to this conversation we're having. So the central bank as the key engine for the government when it comes to the financial system, and who is the midwife for the banks. Then you have the oil and gas industry. I'm not sure about how much the regulator in that industry will be able to do, which is the Ministry of Petroleum Resources. But I think somehow we need to bring the Federal Ministry of Petroleum Resources to the conversation, because again, if you look at the relationship between the NNPC and some of the indigenous upstream operators, like Oando, for example, ITEL, for example, there's a relationship between NPDC, which is the upstream production arm of the NNPC, with these oil companies. So they also need to come into the conversation. Then you have the federal government at the other end that needs the revenue from oil sector moving forward. So you need to have these three, if you like, the triangle kind of discussion moving forward. So it's not just between the banks and the central bank, but we need to involve the NNPC, Ministry of Petroleum Resources, on the side of the government here, and that is how this conversation should go. So what are the immediate things they could do? The financial system need not to break its back because of this exposure to the oil and gas. The little difference between 2020 and 2014 or so, the past was because back then the exposure was much to those who are in the downstream sector, and the first subsidy issue was much on the table then. This time it goes with the guys who are in the core production. The cost of oil production in Nigeria, crude production, is about $22 a barrel. We're selling a Brent at about $20 today. It went down to 10 and what have you. That's the big story. So we need to position the industry and the conversation or the solution in a way that the indigenous upstream operators will still be very critical to the Nigerian economy moving forward. And then when oil industry or the oil industry problems go away or abate significantly, we don't want a situation in which we have crippled these indigenous oil firms to the extent that the field is there for the foreign operators to take over. At the same time, we don't want to kill the banks who will always be the engine of growth for this very critical industry. So banks, very critical, oil and gas, upstream operators, indigenous upstream operators, very critical.
Boason, let me follow up with this quickly, which is still, Boason, I'd like you to take this. What are the likely consequences of a non-intervention by government in this entire bad loan issue? Let's just look at the worst scenario. What would be the consequences? Before I go back to Doctor.
Well, I think right now, I'm sure the federal government is thinking of the solution to it. This is the first time that Nigeria has to stop crude oil production in the manner I was speaking. This is the first time since independence that the country's back is against the wall. So right now, the government's major source of revenue or for FX is up against the wall. So I'm sure right now, as we speak on this show, I'm sure the federal government to the FNPR and the NNPC, they're already having some conversations. I'm sure the GMD of the NNPC right now, the minister, Timothy Silva, will be having conversations with both the international or the IOCs and the indigenous oil firms. I'm sure right now this conversation will be going on critically. What do we do? How much is your exposure to the banking sector? How do we mitigate the relationship we've had before? Because the book is always being shared between the NNPC, which is the State Oil Corporation, and this indigenous oil upstream sector operators. So they have a relationship. They're taking crude, the government is taking crude, the oil operators need to be paid. Yeah. And the person in the middle of them is the banks. So whichever way you look at it, the bank is at the middle. So whether we like it, that conversation, I'm sure is going on right now at a level, even though this may not yet be made public. I want to believe that seriously.
Okay, Dr. Bongo, now, let me ask you the kind of intervention program that you would recommend to help stabilize the indigenous oil producers' operations and help secure financial system stability. That's for Dr. Bongo.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank Boason for the insight, very deep, fund insight that you've provided. Now, I would like to, paint a more optimistic scenario. First of all, oil is not yet, apocalypse for the oil industry. So if we listen to the conversations going on, a lot of webinars, so there is this apocalyptic tone, for the oil and gas sector. But I don't want to believe that. Why? Because if we look at the technology that drives oil usage, utilization globally, which is the combustion engine, so it's still the basis, it's still what drives production in all the factories all over the world. So renewable energy, yes, there's been a lot of emphasis. There is this shift also to renewables, but I don't think as it stands today with the production technology that renewables can compete favorably with the fossil fuel. Now, I stand to be a challenge there as well. But what I'm trying to say is that we still, we've got some headroom when it comes to the duration of oil relevance and salience in the global production system. So what I'm saying in effect that oil definitely will bounce back. So what we need in the interim is a short-term measure to make sure, as Boason has pointed out, that our indigenous upstream oil and gas companies do not go under. At the same time, it is important for us to protect the banks. So what sort of conversation, what sort of negotiation? I've been a proponent of a negotiated solution to the challenge that we have economy-wide. So it's not just for the oil and gas upstream companies, it's for the general oil and gas sector and for the economy as a whole. So right now, so I like to put it this way. Now we have a situation that wasn't primarily caused by economic problems. So in January, nobody will give you the kind of scenario that we are facing right now. Nobody saw it coming. So it started as a health challenge, a health pandemic. But of course, once we're talking about health, this of course is teaching us a very hard lesson that we can never neglect the health sector that is actually critical. It's number one. So anything that threatens our life threatens everything. So you can see where how the economy has been brought to its knees simply because our health and safety and lives, survivability have been challenged. So everybody is now, the preoccupation is how to protect the critical asset, which is life. So life before anything. So having said that, now the conversation should be generally for the economy. We need to protect jobs. So protecting jobs means that the government can also guarantee its own survival, because without the jobs, without people paying jobs, right? Having jobs and being able to pay taxes and buy, so aggregate demand, we know that will drop significantly. And when that happens, factories cannot produce. And if they're not producing, there's no demand for oil as well. So I'm looking at the local market because you can also extrapolate it to the global system. So first, we need to protect jobs. Next, we need to protect the firms okay, that are returning those jobs. So we need to find, it has to be a universal solution. It has to be a global consensus. So it's not just for one sector. So what works for the oil and gas industry should work for the Nigerian economy as a whole. So it's a negotiated solution. I was talking about how we understand this. You see, it wasn't triggered by economics as such. So it came from the health system, and then collapsed the economy. So what happened is that people now, everybody's cautious. There is no money. Doc. Everybody's cautious about spending. Nobody wants to spend.
Yes.
So with that, if it's other times when we have normal recession, you will say, okay, let the government spend its way out of the recession. But we cannot even say that now, because if the government is also badly hit. So we need a lot of negotiation. Get all the interested parties, all the stakeholders have to be brought to the table.
Indeed. But Boason, let me quickly take you through in 60 seconds. Let's look at the issue, even the move by the banks to give moratorium at the moment on principal sums and not interest. Some are picking holes in this move, saying it's not the way to go. I don't know how that comes to you.
Well, I thank you. And Bungwadi spoke generally to why it is critical for us and the government to fix this. But it's also important that the banks are stepping forward and say, they're providing some moratorium on the principle that the oil and gas companies or hydrocarbon firms are owing, especially the indigenous. They must remember that the bank must remember, and this is trying to strike the middle of the road here, they can't just give moratorium on the principle without giving moratorium on the interest. Because if the oil and gas firms are not doing business, principally speaking, where would the money to pay the interest on those loans to the banks come from? So it has to be a total package. The banks must be ready to take some measure of risks. And how they work this out with the oil and gas firms, they need to find it out. Look, they are friends. Banks and oil companies in Nigeria are friends. That is known. If you're doing oil in any bank that is not a friend to oil and gas business in Nigeria, is not in banking business. So let us get that straight. They know themselves and they know how the industry works. The banks have had some measure of experience in dealing with the oil and gas companies. If you remember, just about 10 years ago, when we start having some indigenous oil companies like Owando, Itel, and the rest of them, FAMFA, and all that, taking off some of the asset sale by some of the IOCs in onshore the operation in Nigeria, and they lend to them. So it's a good faith. If the indigenous banks are not lending, are not taking risks and sharing the benefit and the reward with indigenous oil firms, then who else would do that? We want Nigeria to do more in terms of local content. We want to see Nigerian oil companies play more within this hydrocarbon industry, which will still remain with us for some years to come. We just can't tell whether it's going to be 10 or 20 or 50 or 100 years to come. But whether we like it or not, the local banks need the local oil players, and local oil players, indigenous oil firms, need the local banks as well. Because both of them belong to Nigeria. Nigerian authorities need both of them. So we need to create jobs. The agency responsible for local content, there's still a lot we can do for us to do within the hydrocarbon industry. A lot of about the gas flaring, we have a lot of business to do in terms of the derivatives that come from oil and gas beyond petrol, diesel, kerosene. So the business or the relationship between the banks and the oil industry should not be put into pieces or chaos or disruption. Because on both sides, the government is going to lose. The central bank on one hand, and the Nigerian government on the other hand. The central bank is Nigeria. Nigeria is the central bank.
All right.
And the banks are also Nigerians. The oil and gas need them. So if one sector fails, the other fails. That's where we are right now. So we don't need to go for mutually assured destruction. We need to go for mutually assured survival, which is MES. In other words, take the risk. Don't look at the principal alone. Look at the interest. How can we give a moratorium here that the central bank or the NNPC or Ministry of Petroleum Resources or the sovereignty of Nigeria can guarantee? I'm sure the Nigerian government can guarantee the indigenous oil firms to the extent that Nigeria as a sovereign state will remain for the foreseeable future. That is the guarantee that the federal government should hand over to the oil companies, and the central bank back the banks as well, and they come to the center of the table.
Boason Omofai there, I must thank you very much, Chief Executive Officer of Frontier Africa Reports, and also Dr. Bongo Adi is a senior economist from the Lagos Business School. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us, Business Nigeria, this afternoon. Moving on, it's time to talk through highlights of the closing trade today at the Nigerian Stock Exchange. The market closed positive with all share index up 0.54%. The top gainers for the day are Nestle, Guaranty, Trust Bank, Zenith Bank, Dangote Sugar, and FBNH. Major decliners include Unilever, WAPCO, AfriProd, Interbrew, and Caviton. Well, that's our show today. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you tomorrow and we'll continue the discussion. Enjoy the rest of your day.